On the 10th of October 1957, a fire broke out at the Windscale nuclear facility on the west coast of England. The flames sent vast quantities of radioactive material billowing up into the atmosphere. It was, and remains, the United Kingdom's most serious nuclear accident. But at the time, no residents from the surrounding area were evacuated, and most of the details of the fire were swiftly hushed up. It would be years before the true extent of the damage caused by the Windscale fire was revealed. Windscale was constructed on the site of a former munitions factory in 1947. Rather than explosives, though, this new facility would be producing something much more dangerous: nuclear material for use in bombs, as part of the still relatively new British nuclear weapons programme. Although Britain had worked with America to produce the bombs which destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, once the Second World War was over, America became reluctant to share its nuclear secrets, leaving British politicians stung. As they saw it, Britain desperately needed to develop nuclear weapons both as a deterrent to attack from other countries and in order to stay on an even footing with America. Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin advised the Prime Minister that they simply had to have nuclear bombs, whatever it cost. And so, Windscale was built, a plant designed to produce enough plutonium and tritium to make Britain a nuclear power. This production process would take place primarily within two structures, which were known as piles. Each pile consisted of a 2,000-ton, or 2 million kilogram, graphite core, riddled with channels into which uranium fuel rods were inserted. Inside the core, the fuel rods would react with one another, producing small amounts of plutonium and huge amounts of heat. As more rods were inserted, rods already in the core would be pushed through to the other side, eventually dropping out the far end and falling into a channel of water to cool off. There was one major issue though. Quite often the fuel rods would simply miss the channel on the other side, landing with a bump on the floor instead. This was such a common occurrence that staff routinely had to suit up, approach the cooling channel, and manually push the fuel rods back into the water with shovels. This state of affairs was, suffice to say, not ideal, but any safety concerns that workers had were swept aside. Management at Windscale was under enormous pressure from the government to deliver the materials for Britain's nuclear arsenal. Safety, in this climate, took a back seat to rapid progress. On the 7th of October 1957, the reactor within Pile 1 began to register greater levels of heat than was normal. Operators attempted to dispel this heat through something known as a Wigner release, essentially heating up the whole core and then letting it cool down to dispel stored energy in a controlled manner, rather than in an uncontrolled burst. This procedure had been used 8 times in the history of Windscale's existence, and had been successful every time. This time, however, the Wigner release didn't have the desired effect. Temperatures in most of the reactor began to fall, except for in one particular channel, 2053, where the temperature was rising out of control. On the 8th of October, the operators tried the release again. It seemed to work as expected at first, a relief for the operators, but a relief that wouldn't last for long. By the morning of the 10th of October, the temperature in the reactor was rising once again. It was very clear that something was wrong. Operators tried to use cooling fans to bring the temperature down, but instead heat just kept accumulating. At the same time, sensors in the chimney above detected radiation, and workers cited smoke escaping from the chimney. Suddenly, the truth became evident. One or more cartridges had broken open and were on fire within the reactor. This changed everything. The fans, rather than cooling the graphite core, were making the problem worse by fanning the flames. Workers began to troubleshoot with whatever materials they had available. First, they grabbed scaffolding poles and attempted to use them to push the burning cartridges out of the reactor. This didn't work. The cartridges were firmly lodged and the heat so intense that the ends of some poles melted. Workers then tried to smother the flames with carbon dioxide, but couldn't direct enough of it onto the fire. Water hoses were hooked up to the reactor, a calculated risk since introducing water would generate hydrogen and might lead to an explosion, but one which they took nonetheless. But again, it just didn't work. The temperature within the core was by now well over 1000 degrees centigrade, or over 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. Water wouldn't cut it. In the end, workers shut off the supply of oxygen to the fire in an attempt to smother it. Again, this was a risky move as it required shutting off the cooling fans. These were the only things which made the temperature within the reactor tolerable for firefighters. But it appeared to work. The fire shrunk and eventually died. For days afterwards, workers continued to dampen it with water, just to be safe. A report on the incident was quickly compiled, but the Prime Minister at the time, Harold Macmillan, ordered it to be censored. The bare facts of the matter would make the public lose confidence in nuclear power and spoil any hope of a nuclear partnership with America. The incident was hushed up. Any long-standing safety issues at Windscale were swept under the rug, and the fire was blamed on an error of judgment by the operators of the pile. It was insisted that most of the radioactive material had blown harmlessly out to sea. Nobody was evacuated from the area surrounding Windscale, and the only really dramatic precaution taken was the disposal of hundreds of tons of milk which had been produced in the area. The true extent of the damage would not become public knowledge for many years. We know now that a significant quantity of dangerous radioactive material was released into the atmosphere by the fire, including 740 terabecquerels of iodine-131. Iodine-131 was of particular concern because, despite a very short half-life, it can be absorbed and stored in the thyroid, causing an increased risk of cancer. While the Board of Inquiry, which met just 2 weeks after the fire was extinguished, insisted that the fire had caused no danger to the public, subsequent investigations disagree. While the impact of the Windscale fire is almost impossible to gauge with any certainty, it's estimated that around 100 people from nearby areas might have died prematurely because of exposure to radioactive materials released during the incident. This death toll might have been much worse, were it not for the cautious approach of Chief Engineer Jonathan Cockcroft. During construction, he insisted on the fitting of filters into the piles at Windscale. This was not a popular decision at the time. Filters would drive up cost and cause a huge delay in the project, and they were something that other people working on the project were adamant were unnecessary. So annoyed were some engineers by Cockcroft's insistence on installing filters that they took to referring to them as Cockcroft's follies. This mockery stopped immediately when the incident occurred. The filters, as it turned out, prevented around 95% of the radioactive material released by the fire from escaping. Thomas Toohey, the reactor manager at the time, was another unrecognised hero. He oversaw the entire operation to bring the fire under control, something which included personally climbing up the pile to inspect the fire not just once, but multiple times. Toohey was well aware of the danger, but remained dedicated to his duties. He even quietly disposed of his radiation detecting badge, so that nobody could tell that he was over his exposure limit and insist that he leave the site. His contribution was never officially recognised, but he did go on to live a full life, dying at the age of 90 after emigrating to Australia with his family. As for Windscale, it has been renamed Sellafield, and the site is now dedicated to processing nuclear waste and to decommissioning the facilities left over from Britain's nuclear weapons programme. The site is vast and complex, and the decommissioning work is painstaking. Even if everything goes to plan, the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority does not expect the site to be fully decommissioned until the year 2144. The complexity of the site and the dangers involved help to explain the long timescale. There are around 1,000 buildings on site, many of which are scheduled to be demolished. In some cases, though, the radiation levels within are too extreme for any human ever to enter. For other buildings, the records detailing exactly what they were used for have been lost. Robots are used to survey and then to carefully disassemble contaminated structures. The material is then sealed within concrete blocks or vitrified in solid glass. These containers are stacked in a warehouse and monitored constantly. So dangerous is the material here that the site has its own police force and fire service. Rather than relying on an alarm system to sound when something goes wrong, Sellafield employs an alarm that sounds constantly when there hasn't been a containment failure. Should it ever cease, workers would instantly know that something was amiss. This intense, dangerous, painstaking work will continue for decades to come. Tens of thousands of workers from multiple generations will come and go before the danger of Windscale is finally neutralized.